All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you guys are all enjoying your lunch. We're going to bring up our afternoon keynote speaker here in just a moment. Our keynote this afternoon is going to be Oliver Leclerc. Oliver is a senior partner in McKinsey's Southern California office. He serves pharmaceutical, biotech, and medical product clients on strategic and operational improvement issues. His clients range from multi-billion-dollar corporations to pre-IPO biotech companies. Oliver is a leader of the McKinsey Life Sciences practice, where he currently serves as the head of the biotech sub-practice. He has had multiple projects aimed at developing actionable technology, product strategy, and post-merger transformation. I would like to bring Oliver to the stage now. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Olivier. As my accent cannot tell you, I live in California, and I've been living in California for 23 years. So it's not Oliver, it's Olivier. As you can tell, I'm French. We want to talk about biotechnology today, and I lead our biotechnology practice. Unbeknownst to a lot of people, McKinsey actually doesn't serve only large organizations. We actually serve small companies. The smaller clients I currently serve actually has 8 people in a lab. So we do actually quite a lot of work actually in biotech. And I'm very, very pleased to be with you today because I think you're all, as I understand, either investors in biotech or founders or early stage companies. So we have 3 topics today. The first one is actually around the state of the biotech industry. Second is around sort of the, how the next generation of biotech could be different. And we can talk about actually some of these themes have been, talked about actually in the previous panel, so we can expand upon it a little bit. And then what should be on biotech CEO agendas going forward. Now, let me start. Yesterday, I was with a veteran investor in biotech, and he was telling me that he thought actually that was one of the worst investment or funding environment in biotech in the last 30 years. Now, I have to say, in spite of my gray hair, I wasn't there 30 years ago, so I can tell. I can completely opine. But what we know is that clearly, actually, we are in a challenging funding environment. What you'll hear today is there are silver linings, and I want to emphasize some of them today in the presentation. Number one. Number two is I have to say I'm unabashedly positive and optimistic about the industry, and I'll show you why. And I'll start actually with a very simple number. Since we're starting with lunch, I thought I would start with a very simple number, and the number is 1. And interestingly, actually, it shows you actually how vibrant this industry has been over the past 10 years. If you look at the biotech industry over the past 10 years, overall, it's 1 biotech founded per day in this industry worldwide. It's actually quite impressive. 1 biotech per day. I don't know if there are lots of industries like this in the world. Maybe the tech industry. It's hard to say, but actually it shows you how vibrant the industry is. A couple of other numbers again with 1. 1 trillion. Now we're talking about the last 20 years. 1 trillion total value from acquisitions. So if you can actually take all the acquisitions that have been made, essentially, it sums up to about $1 trillion. And actually, sort of $1 trillion generated. Now, this is actually sort of an estimate, but we thought 1 and 1 was actually quite a nice set of numbers. And then actually total, what's more important for patients and for all of us, actually, it's 500 therapies commercialized by originators or via partners actually over the past 20 years. Which is actually very impressive as well. We are probably what we call, and again, we can debate this, whether it's a 3rd wave, the 4th wave, but we consider actually the 3rd wave, actually, sort of at least the way we look at it. Right, the 1st wave was small molecules, 2nd was sort of peptide, recombinant proteins. We're now in the 3rd wave of innovation with, as you know, sort of cell and gene therapy, RNA technologies, et cetera, coming to fruition and actually showing sort of massive impact on the world and on new therapies. Just a note, actually, since we're in Boston, and I wanted to show you actually sort of, where the biotech in the world are located today in general. And you see actually sort of, Massachusetts here actually stands actually in a very nice position. It's number 2 in the US after California, and actually sort of number 2 in the world. China is a bit, actually it's a close third, but that's kind of what we see today actually sort of in terms of geographic extension of the industry. Now, let's talk for a second about actually the environment and about what's going on. Well, everybody knows actually it's sort of we are in a difficult funding environment, and companies are feeling the pinch, and it's very clear that some will disappear, and some are already disappearing, I guess. The silver lining, one silver lining could be actually sort of that there's a return to investment discipline. And I'll show you what I mean by that in a few slides, actually, sort of when I show you actually sort of the state of the pipeline. But if you look at the biotech funding, in general, it's actually a challenging environment. It's not that awful either. It's 2022, look at it here, is of course of its peak actually sort of, from 2020 and 2021. But look at 22 versus 17, 18, 19. Actually, it's not that bad of a number. Now, 23, if I look at the numbers 23, which are not on the chart, I'm going to give you actually a couple of numbers. They're dramatically off. If you look at Q1 23 versus Q1 21, in Q1 21, the aggregate VC funding was about $12 billion, right? In Q1 23, it's 4. So there was a division by 3 of the aggregate VC funding between 2021 and 2023. And if you look at sort of Q1 23 again, only 60 startups got a first round of funding in Q1 23 in the US, which is roughly as low as when it was in 2013 or 2014. So we're back to sort of 10 years ago in terms of sort of funding for new biotech, for new biotech companies in the US today. What is interesting is that this doesn't correlate at all with actually the dry powder that actually VCs have accumulated over the past couple of years. So we have massive dry powder at investor level, and of course actually sort of very cautious investors right now. But in a sense, you could see this as a positive way, which is okay, they're ready to invest as well, and they're going to have to invest, right? I mean, this dry powder has to be deployed somehow, somewhere, right? So we can see actually some funding actually coming down the pipe, whether it's actually early, it's not going to be in 2020, maybe not early 2023, maybe the back end of 23 or 24, right, depending on sort of who you listen to. But actually that's actually at least a positive sign. All right, now, next question in the discussion today was how biotech is going to be different going forward. Now, it's very hard to answer this question, as you can imagine, but we thought actually we would actually approach this with 3 different themes or ideas. The first one is, the question around platforms, right? If you actually build a company today, you can build a platform, you can build actually sort of, a single asset or a couple of assets actually in your company. And I'll show you actually sort of the funding in a minute. Actually, you'll see actually platforms actually are in vogue, or at least were in vogue for the last 2 or 3 years. The second one, of course, that everyone knows and hears about is AI. And we should talk also about actually sort of the evolution of these companies and what is the impact that AI is going to have on the industry in general. And the third one is, I know we are talking here about sort of founders of early stage companies, but at some point, you may consider commercialization. And actually, I'll encourage you actually in a later stage of the discussion actually to look at commercial issues actually early on, because they do matter actually even for very early stage companies. The question is, are some companies approaching commercialization differently, and why? Okay. So those are the 3 themes, and then we can debate. Hopefully, I can answer some of the questions you may have actually on the back end of this. So let me start with platforms. This is an analysis we did last year. We're going to probably update it next year or this year. Last year, what we did is we actually took all the investments in biotech, and we looked at one by one companies, actually, whether they were a platform company or a call it an asset-based company, right? And what we call by platform is, if you will, a base or an infrastructure on which other therapies can be developed, or multiple therapies can be developed. This is essentially sort of, what we came up with, and we show actually sort of, in the total funding, about 2/3 of the funding went to what we call platforms, right? And then again, we did it actually sort of hand by hand because there was no other way to do it. Now that is interesting, and what you see here, it's also platforms across a range of technologies. It's not actually just one technology, it's actually a range of technologies: cell therapy, precision medicine, new delivery methods that are increasingly important, et cetera, et cetera. So you see actually sort of platforms are emerging as sort of a major investment theme in general. So why is that? Couple of ideas maybe. One is, if you look at sort of compared to non-platform biotechs, of course they have larger pipelines. By definition, that's the definition of a platform. They can actually sort of generate more product actually with the same base. And they actually sort of did actually a lot more out-licensing deals over the last 10 years. So there may be actually something here. I would add a couple of things. One is, we know that some of these platforms have matured. You can think about RNAi, mRNA. I mean, like, think about actually sort of, ADCs. I mean, like, all kind of platforms in the industry have sort of matured and actually have shown actually very, large promises. And actually sort of, some of them, as you know, like mRNA, have been actually truly transformative. So that's one thing. The other thing that probably is missing from the chart is the fact that if you have a platform, typically actually you may have actually multiple modalities. And what we see when we actually work with those platform companies and we work on a strategy is very often what happens is some of the modalities, contrary to what people believe actually, so there is a little bit, they're not fully correlated. So the risk, if you will, that you may incur in one modality may actually not be correlated to the risk in another modality, right? It's not because you fail in one modality that you're not going to fail. You're going to fail in the other, and so overall, there may be actually some hedging going on actually, and you can actually sort of, if you're thoughtful about actually the way you create your program and the way you actually sort of sequence your program, can be actually sort of hedging your risk actually around the platforms. So that's one theme sort of I wanted to touch on, and of course, we don't have the time to expand upon it, but actually that may be one thing actually for the industry going forward, for sure. The second one is AI. Now, AI, I show you here actually, so this is the global capital investment in AI-driven drug discovery over the past few years, like from 2016 to 2021. So you see 2016 is, tiny, and actually sort of, you see the massive exponential curve here. Which is actually quite interesting. Now, 2020 is, again, it's low or lower than 2021, but still actually sort of pretty robust as an investment or funding essentially for these companies. And what is interesting here is that it's not just AI drug discovery. Many of these companies have realized that it's actually very hard to actually differentiate just on the basis of algorithm. Right, so I don't know if we have any big pharma players here, but if you actually talk to a head of R&D in big pharma, they are being completely bombarded actually every day by companies that have that claim to have a better mousetrap on AI drug discovery, right? So how do you differentiate from there? Right? It's actually very nice to say I have a great algorithm. Actually, you need to prove it. How do you prove it? Well, you need to add to dry lab capabilities. You typically have to add wet lab capabilities, actually, because you need to generate the data. And we've seen, essentially, by the way, a massive transformation of wet lab capabilities in those companies and in multiple companies today to be allowed to allow to generate data actually fast and actually sort of treat this data. But beyond that, actually, what is interesting, they realize they have to kind of go to drug development, and actually they have to go to, at some point, a phase 1. And actually prove that actually the better mousetrap, if you will, actually has translated to actual medicine, right? So all these companies who actually sort of were supposed to be tech companies initially are all merging into and becoming essentially sort of fully integrated biotech companies over time, right? And now a lot of these programs are still in preclinical stage, but that's what we see, right? So that's the I would say the second piece. Now, on AI, I would add a couple of things, and I'll show you a few numbers later on in the presentation as well. One is, this is not limited to small companies. large companies in pharma are investing massively in those capabilities as well, which is actually quite interesting because if you're an AI company trying to kind of make a deal with pharma, very often you compete with actually the internal team as well. So there's an interesting dynamic there, number one. Number two is AI is, right now we're talking about dry lab and wet lab. Reality is that actually sort of what we see more and more is the more advanced players are using AI to design a trial, to actually to recruit patients, to conduct the trial, et cetera, et cetera. So AI actually sort of now is blending into actually sort of the whole R&D value chain, and is having a massive impact, and I'll show you actually some numbers in a minute. So that's kind of second theme, which is, you know, AI, pervasive, and the notion of having AI-only company is probably sort of, you know, a misnomer. Actually, they're all actually becoming pretty much biotech companies today. And then there's the third question is around, and I realize I'm going fast, but third question is around commercialization. So we ask ourselves, and there was actually a panelist earlier that actually mentioned this, says, okay, you know, should we commercialize ourselves, right? Is that actually a good idea? So we looked at the top 1,000 biotechs, and we sort of, you know, removed some of them that had only preclinical assets. We went into sort of companies that actually sort of had commercial assets. So you can see actually from 1,000 you end up with 200. Most of them, as you can see, actually 136 out-licensed their commercial assets. So they decided not to actually commercialize at all. Only 43 actually sort of had a direct commercial presence in one region, right? Or one or two regions. And only 24 out of 1,000 ended up actually having a commercial presence in more than 2 or 3 regions. Right? Shows you actually how difficult probably it is to kind of to sort of commercialize. Now, there's a reason for this. It's interesting, and again, the panelist was talking earlier about actually how difficult it is to launch. It is difficult to launch, right? And what we did here is we looked at we divided essentially companies into experienced launchers, so companies that actually have launched several drugs over the past few years, versus first-time launchers. And we looked at the performance of the launches, right? So I'm not going to say that you cannot be successful as a biotech launching a drug. Don't get me wrong. But statistically speaking, you can see actually sort of, you know, experienced launchers, the median achievement of expected forecast, you know, for experienced launchers was about 93%. For first-time launcher, it was only 63%. And you can see actually sort of successful launches, and again, very difficult to, you know, what do we call a successful launch? We actually define it as exceeding analyst expectations, you know, a definition like any other. And here you can see actually sort of on the left-hand side, actually, you know, about 50% of experienced launchers exceeded expectations from analysts. Only sort of 39 actually sort of, you know, from first-time launchers. So it's actually hard. It's actually not easy to kind of launch and build the infrastructure and actually sort of also have enough drugs actually in the pipeline to actually feed that infrastructure over time, right? Which comes back a little bit to the platform question, actually, sort of, can you do this as a sort of, you know, maybe you can do this as a platform company. And interestingly enough, there we go, actually, sort of, you know, who are the companies that actually are growing very fast, actually, and sort of, you know, providing actually sort of a complete, actually, sort of geographic landscape. Biotech, Moderna, clearly, the good example. We talked about Horizon and Seagen, and those two companies actually happen to be actually been acquired, but essentially it's still true, actually. Horizon actually sort of was not a platform company, but actually sort of they had actually a bunch of rare diseases, and they fit, I would say, a definition of companies that actually sort of in rare disease area that have tried to kind of build their own infrastructure. So you have Horizon, you have Axion, which was bought by AZ, BioMarin, same thing, actually sort of, you know, all these companies in the rare disease space, you know, they felt that actually it was okay actually and probably actually better for them to build an infrastructure. And then Seagen actually with the ADC platform. So we can see actually sort of a few companies are trying to do that. But you need to have the right, essentially, portfolio and the right sort of the right pipeline for this. If you're Moderna, you have 49 or 50 actually drugs in your pipeline right now, so you can probably absorb actually. And then, but you actually made also $19 billion from COVID, so that helps. But in general, actually, sort of, you know, those companies are building their own infrastructure. What is interesting here is that, by the way, it used to be I'm going US first, then I do EU, Japan, and rest of the world. These guys are doing this simultaneously. So they're building plants everywhere. They have actually sort of a footprint that is actually already global from the get-go. All right, so just to summarize actually this section, one is, clearly there's a nice potential from platforms. They actually sort of offer a way to scale innovation in unprecedented ways. Two is we're convinced that AI is transforming this industry. It's already the case, you know it, you're probably actually sort of doing research, you have to kind of have the data, you have to generate the data, you have to have the labs, the wet labs actually allow you to actually generate this data at scale if you want to kind of feed those models. And it's becoming an integral part of the industry along the value chain. And then actually sort of, frankly, jury's still out on commercialization. I think it's hard for a biotech company to think about commercializing. And so at least, many of my clients anyway, choose actually to commercialize in the US and actually sort of, leave the infrastructure, the commercial infrastructure to others actually in other geographies. Especially if you think about Europe, which is increasingly challenging from a value standpoint and actually a price standpoint. It's very hard actually to build an infrastructure at scale in Europe. Actually, that offsets actually the cost and actually makes it profitable for you to be in Europe. So you'll see the US remains a highly profitable market. So if you have actually a sort of a reasonably targeted actually population of patients and physicians, it can be actually very profitable to commercialize in the US even as a biotech. All right. Then based on that, what should be on CEO agendas? So let me start by a couple of things. First of all, I'll start with the left-hand side. I'm not going to talk too much about this because I'm sure you've been sort of, you talked about a lot of this. Everybody sort of, knows innovation pipeline by definition, access to capital by definition, and talent, right? These are must-have, very hard to do. Actually, very hard to actually get the right talent. Someone was talking about it actually earlier. Money is one thing, but then actually you need to get the right talent, and it's not easy. Especially if you're, by the way, a young company with a founder, it's not the same mindset. The people who actually sort of are building those companies from the get-go, what we found is it's not the same mindset. And by the way, what happens very often is as the companies grow, and they grow fast, the initial team doesn't grow as fast as the company. So you need essentially to kind of, and it's actually heartbreaking in many ways. What happens is actually over time, you see the founding team essentially sort of, being set aside and actually moving away, and actually sort of new people coming in, and you actually constantly, it's actually sort of, a CEO told me, my company is growing faster than my people. In mindset, in talent, and so I need to essentially replace them. And it's heartbreaking because these people actually have built a company. They've been actually at the heart of this. Actually, they made it. They made it where it is. But over time, you need to kind of be willing to let them go and actually replace them. So that anyway, enough on talent. That's another discussion. But I thought about actually sort of three themes that I wanted to address. One is portfolio prioritization. Two is asset acceleration, and three is, again, a little bit, I'll finish on commercialization briefly. So portfolio prioritization, why do I think it's important? Let me show you why. This is an analysis we did. We took all the pathways and all the targets actually that are in this industry, and we looked at what we called pipeline herding or target crowding over time, right? And you can see three curves here. 2000, 2010, 2020. This is for the top 25 most targeted pathways, right? And of course, they differ actually depending on where we are. 2010 actually were not the same, but and you see essentially the crowding on these pathways essentially over time. And you see how much essentially sort of, between 2000 and 2020 actually sort of the amount of crowding has increased dramatically, right? And look at the exponential, look at the 57 over there. This is PD-L1 worldwide. We have 57 PD-L1 in development right now. I mean, we used to last year. We probably have less now. That shows you essentially over time an average increase for the top 10 targets of, it's essentially a factor of 3.3, more than 3. So what happened in this industry over the past few years is essentially this, right? You had massive funding, we had massive funding, and we wasted a lot of it. Because we're going, I'm not saying that, by the way, we shouldn't have actually multiple companies actually on the same target. This is not my point. It can be very valuable to have actually multiple companies on the same target and actually start developing different drugs. But when we actually can reach this kind of crowding, it shows that actually sort of the resource allocation of this industry is not optimal. And actually sort of you can ask yourself, okay, as an investor, as a board, as a management team, am I doing actually sort of, do I want to be the 57th actually PDL1 in this industry? Probably not, right? So there is a, in a sense, yes, the funding environment is tough, but you could argue the discipline that's going to come up actually is going to sort of, we'll see actually companies disappear, but it may not be a bad thing. Actually, it may be actually a forcing device for actually sort of a bit more investment discipline going forward in this industry. So that's one. And so again, thinking about sort of the choice you have to make, the portfolio you create, and by the way, that's actually a big part of the work we do, actually, frankly. When platform companies come to us, they have a myriad of opportunities, and they say, okay, what is actually sort of, where should I place my bets? How should I sequence those bets? Actually, that's actually sort of the key questions, and sort of one of the key strategy questions we actually have to address. And so we look at this, and we're very careful about not going anywhere near this. Well, this, by the way, it's not surprising that 80% of trials fail to meet enrollment timelines, right? If you have such a target crowdings, if you're actually following actually sort of the herd in terms of indications as well, you end up actually with too many companies chasing too few patients. I didn't bring it actually today. We made an analysis last year of in rare disease actually. In some cases, we had more trial patients being chased by a biotech than actually actual patients in the US, just to give you a sense, in some indications, right? Because everybody was like, okay, well, this is actually a great pathway. It's actually biologically de-risked. I should go after it. Great idea. Well, there are 20 other companies doing the same thing. And by the way, you have only 200 patients in the US for this. So, not surprising that 80% of trial fails. So that's one. Now, this being said, if you think about it, this pipeline herding, and I'm going back to the previous page, right? This is not new. It's going to happen again. It's actually part of the psyche almost of this industry, right? I mean, like, of course, you have a target, it's validated, you want to go after it, right? So what happens then is actually sort of, if you could argue, what is then actually the competitive advantage? Speed. You want to go fast. Because you don't want to be number 57 on the line. You want to be number 2, 3, at most, right? So you have to go fast. And so going back to AI, and we looked at this actually sort of, there's a clear discussion to be had in biotech today. Actually, I'm very often actually we're talking to founders. They are scientists. So they love the bench, they know the bench, they actually sort of, they're great at it, and then they have actually an idea for a drug. Then it becomes a time where actually you have to develop the drug and actually put it in the clinic and go fast in the clinic. And that's where I think as founders, you may want to think ahead about what's going to be needed to kind of go fast. And a lot of it comes down to actually the design of the trial, the kind of patients you want to have. Some patients you can recruit, they're too hard to recruit, it takes too long, it's too cumbersome. So all these practicalities are important. And I would say, I wouldn't expect that necessarily coming to the CROs may not have actually sort of completely they may help, but then they may not be sufficient. They are necessary for sure, but they may not be sufficient actually to help you actually sort of, go fast. But what we can see is that there's a massive potential. If you actually go from roughly we're talking about a third of the time you can actually gain by actually sort of thinking hard about actually the choices you want to make and actually how you actually recruit patients and the kind of activities you do to recruit patients appropriately. So that's enough said on that. And then this is even more important because actually the trends are not favoring you on the commercial side. And so there's in the US, I'm going to talk about the US. In Europe, actually the game is played already. Actually, sort of governments. We're talking about monopsonic buyers for the most time. They actually tell you actually sort of what the price is going to be, and actually sort of pretty much take it or leave it today. And actually, it's going down and down even more. In the US, actually, the IRA was a turning point. It is actually to some extent actually sort of a little bit of European thinking actually coming into the US, which can be scary for some people. And then actually let's be clear, right? I mean, some categories, some very, very, very innovative categories, some very good drugs actually have been I've had a hard time essentially generating profit and enough profit in the US market actually because of PBM pressure and payer pressure, right? Think about PCSK9. Think about migraine. I mean, all these categories are probably actually sort of today actually sort of very, very low in profitability for pharma today, right? And it went very, very fast, by the way. PCSK9, GPCR actually, the migraine side actually went actually sort of, they went actually sort of down to, a very low level of pricing, actually net pricing actually sort of in a matter of a couple of years, right? So this is actually a very tough actually environment. And so my point here is not actually to be discouraging, it's actually more about as you think about the kind of drug you want to develop, it's actually very important. Pharma knows it, but it's actually sort of, as a biotech company, actually what we don't see enough is actually sort of this notion of, okay, am I really creating a commercial drug or a drug that actually can be commercialized down the road? Because that's going to matter ultimately even if you reach phase 2 with great data on your drug and actually pharma doesn't have any interest because it's actually sort of crowded place or it's not differentiated enough or the payers will not pay for it, then we may as well know actually ahead of time, right? So pharma does it actually a bit better, not perfect yet, but actually a bit better now, actually getting commercial input early. But biotech doesn't do it as much. And so that's where I think as founders, it's actually important to talk to people early on, actually sort of have this kind of feedback on, okay, how is the commercial landscape evolving, right, over time. And I'll finish on this actually sort of, if you want to, again, you're very early stage, so maybe many of you are not thinking about launch, but actually as you think about launch, but it's actually worth actually thinking about launch in a sense, right, early on, and say, if I had to launch this drug tomorrow, or actually sort of in 5 years, what will I need, right? And it's not just resourcing, it's also actually thinking about actually the differentiation, what's going on in the rest of the pipeline, what will happen in 5 years, what will actually sort of hit, because ultimately when you want to partner that drug, even if you don't want to commercialize it, actually it will matter, right? So that's it. I sort of, I think I'm done actually with my 30 minutes. I can probably take any questions, some questions if you wish. Hopefully that was helpful. Thank you. Any questions or, yep, sorry.
Probably pretty loud.
Yeah.
Now, thank you for a great framing. How do you think about that last point of building commercializable drugs for companies that are at a high cost of capital, where you hear from investors, speed to data really matters? Well-funded big biotechs and pharma have the effectively unlimited resources to build that in. But how do you think about that trade-off for companies that every dollar really counts, and you don't get to launch it if you don't get to the data?
So if I understand the question well, my sense is if you're a small biotech today, my point of view is actually you may not ultimately commercialize that drug, and that's okay, right? Someone else will, or you'll partner it. You will end up partnering it actually in phase 2, and that's okay as well. My main point is making sure that actually as you think about the drug pipeline you're creating and the portfolio you're creating, let's make sure you get actually the commercial viewpoint early on, right? Let's make sure and I see too many people saying, oh, we ain't going to interview payers. No, don't interview payers. They're useless, right? Payers don't tell you actually anything when you interview them, actually, right? So interview people actually we deal with payers day to day. Interview actually ex-payers maybe. People actually left the payer industry actually sort of not long ago, and I can tell you, okay, here's how a payer is going to look at this, right? But very often I see, and again, it's hard, right? As a biotech company, you have a target, you have scientific actually sort of rationale for a drug, and you say, my gosh, it's going to work, right? So I'm going to go there, right? And then it's exciting, of course, but then look at the pipeline. What's going on? What are the other modalities going in? And actually sort of, 5 years ahead or 6 years ahead, what is it going to look like? Right? And again, it's not about commercialization. You're never going to actually sort of compete. Maybe you will, but actually, you don't have to bet on it. But you will compete with those drugs when it's time to partner in discussion with pharma. And the BD guys will tell you, listen, sorry, we're not interested, right? We have like 5 other companies in the pipeline like this, and then by the way, we have one drug like this in our own pipeline, and by the way, the payers don't want to pay for it. Okay, game done. right? So you spend at least sort of $20 million or $30 million on a drug, and there's nothing to show for it. And don't get me wrong, it happens a lot. Sure, yeah.
My name is Meena Krishnakumar. I have a request and a question for us. The request is the slides are great, and I see a number of my colleagues taking pictures and I'm writing notes. But if you could share the slides, that would be great.
Sure. No problem, yes.
And the question is, you showed how platform-based companies have been getting a lot of investment in the past, recent past. Given the tight capital market and disciplined investment being the key word, would there be at least a short-term shift in focusing towards single asset investments? Because the investments would be, it's all or none risk, I get it, but also probably the investments would be smaller compared to investing on a platform and spreading it thin. So I just wanted to know.
Yeah, great question, thank you. So the question was on platform companies and how we see them evolve over time. And in the current funding environment, do we see actually sort of as much potential? So a couple of thoughts on that. The first one is 2020, 2021 were, I think, years of, as you know, hubris took over, and you ended up actually with companies actually sort of getting to IPO so fast, and only with a bare preclinical pipeline, right? So you see actually some companies actually sort of now suffering in the market because they went too fast. It was a great IPO window, so take advantage of it. Of course, now great valuations, and now actually sort of public funding is actually dead, right? So some of these companies would disappear. Now, if you look at sort of the private funding, I see actually some pretty big rounds in private funding today, interestingly. It's not actually necessarily small rounds. Yeah, it's going to be smaller. I'm saying people are a bit more cautious, but when they believe in the technology, they actually fund it, right? So it's not actually sort of that actually, oh, now we're going down to 10 million A rounds, or no, we actually see actually some interesting rounds actually there. So that's one. Two is ultimately it depends. For me, actually, on the platform side, when we talk about strategy for platform, there's multiple things actually to consider. The first one is what is the time to proof of concept or proof of platform? What do you need to actually get to a point where you have a candidate that shows, okay, the platform actually could work? And that's kind of question number one, which is actually a bit complicated because actually many times the platform companies don't, of course, then you end up actually choosing a target that is actually sort of very well validated, de-risk actually, and then you actually sort of you want to show essentially sort of that it works. Now that's the trade-off, and we need to kind of work actually with that trade-off because then you end up actually not recruiting patients or sort of nobody's interested in that drug. Now, what happens is very often actually sort of some companies have done actually sort of, a sequence where they start with a drug that they know commercially is not going to be great. They may not be able to partner it and then they actually have actually a multiple sort of, other drugs, around it actually that actually are a lot more interesting, more risky, but more interesting. But if you have proof of platform, then actually it becomes actually sort of almost like I can get my funding going on to kind of fund actually the other product as well. So it's a little bit around kind of how you build your portfolio and how you sequence it, right? And without going into the details. So I strongly believe actually there's going to be actually sort of some more funding for platforms. I see it. I actually work with platforms today actually that are very, very early stage, actually literally like I have one actually that's pretty much Series A, pre-Series A, right? So some companies are sort of looking at platform. There are tons of actually sort of opportunities, and so no, I don't believe, to answer your question actually very directly, I don't believe actually the funding is going to dry out. It all depends actually how the portfolio evolves and actually what the story is, but there's still actually some potential there. We're done? Okay, perfect. Well, thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Olivier, and my apologies. I think my Boston accent got the best of me earlier. So thank you, guys. That is going to conclude our plenary sessions for the day. We have our partnering session is now open. That is downstairs in the Longfellow room. Please continue to use the Jujima app to make connections, fill those meeting spaces. We will then at 1 o'clock be moving over to our pitch sessions that are in the Skyline A and B rooms for Biotrack session. Skyline D and E is the MedTech, Health Tech track. And then lastly, regroup back here at 3:30 for some networking and I think some drinks. So thank you guys all for coming and attending. Please head over to meetings and the pitch sessions and have a great rest of the day. Thank you so much.